Joining us now, CNN political analyst David Gregory, former chief of staff for First Lady Laura Bush and Nina McBride, former White House correspondent for ABC News Ann Compton, and CNN legal analyst Shan Wu. I know all of us have our memories of the late president, but Ann, I'm going to start with you because I used to work for you. And I wanted to refer to you. Just reflect on this moment.
There are moments in history that are pretty short. 4 years is all George Bush got. And at that moment in history, the world was changing, totally different than when we grew up. The Soviet Union collapsed, the Berlin Wall fell, there were tinderbox in the Middle East. George Bush had been head of the CIA, UN ambassador, vice president for 8 years. And his conduct of foreign policy was at a time when it revolutionized our world.
Mm-hmm. And I think that he came to personify losing with grace.
Yes.
Though he was only there for 4 years, he never seemed bitter. Mm-hmm. He seemed to be sort of introspective after that about what may have gone wrong. And there's this beautiful, poignant op-ed from President Clinton talking about the letter that he received when he entered the Oval Office. And here is what he goes on to say. Given what politics looks like in America and around the world today, it's easy to sigh and say George H.W. Bush belonged to an era that is now gone and never coming back, where our opponents are not our enemies, where we are open to different ideas and changing our minds, where facts matter, and where our devotion to our children's future leads to honest compromise and shared progress. I know what he would say, nonsense. It's your duty to get that America back.
Right.
Your thoughts?
And also, in the letter that he left to President Clinton that morning, it said, "You're our president now." And that's how he felt about being the leader of the country. Such respect for the position, the institution of the presidency, everyone that works to support our government. And he just, it hurt. That election of 92 hurt a lot. And Barbara Bush talks about that too. And she felt that the better man lost the race. But you know what? They moved on, and they moved on with grace, as you said, led a full life, their entire lives. And and then developed, of course, he developed this incredibly close relationship with the biggest rival of his political career.
You actually, I was reading in 2005, you were traveling with him to the funeral of Pope John Paul II, and you wanted to know, hey, what's going on? What's going on with this friendship with the guy who beat you?
This friendship was blossoming, and all of us who had lived through this difficult election and saw George H.W. Bush sort of diminished a bit by the rhetoric of that campaign, we found it hard to accept it. And I asked him, and he said, look, I'm an old guy. He likes to talk. I like to listen. And he said, I think I'm the father he never had. And that speaks volumes about George H.W.
Oh, my gosh, that's really poignant.
Yeah. And George W. Bush, 43, President Bush, took credit for that union.
Yes, he
almost
did.
like, oh, God, he's like, these two guys, this odd couple, he said, it wouldn't happen without me. But, I am also thinking this morning about the idea of disruption, right? You mentioned it, Ann. So here, President Bush, the 41st, comes into power at a time of great disruption on the world stage and is known for managing it so adeptly, with caution as well. And yet politically, he was subjected to very much the kind of disruption we're living through now. He saw it in the rise of Ross Perot as the Reagan Revolution kind of crumbled and Perot came in, and that had a lot to do with his loss in 92. And the other side of the disruption was the youthful, disruptive Democratic governor from Arkansas in Bill Clinton, which marked a closing of that era, an older era of politics, of a more genteel era of which George H.W. Bush was a part.
Don't forget Pat Buchanan either.
Yes.
Pat Buchanan primaried the president.
That's right.
In a way very reminiscent of Donald Trump. I mean, so in a way, George H.W. Bush was there for the beginning
of that populist right movement as well.
Right, and the transition of the Republican Party all the way around.
And Ross Perot got 19 million votes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Bill Clinton did not get 51% of the vote. Right. Mm-hmm. And George Bush never made a big case out of the fact that he thought Ross Perot was the one who lost it for him.
Wow. I mean, I am struck again in hearing his words now as we revisit all by his humility. Mm-hmm. I think that that's one of his defining characteristics. And I had this great opportunity in, I think it was August of 1999, to go to Kennebunkport and to help him reflect on his time in office. And he was actually there. We are with my crew and me in Kennebunkport. It was a beautiful sunny day.
You're not the one in the blue shirt at the end.
No, I'm the one next to him,
Okay.
smiling broadly. And he talked about how he continues to learn every day and how he learned from his predecessors. In this one soundbite I want to play for you, he talked about what he learned from President Ford. Listen to this.
I learned something from everybody. Even at my age, I learn every day. And I learn from watching him handle large foreign policy problems. So I think it's fair to say that all through my life, I've learned from President Ford. I learned from him when I was president. Now, don't overreact. Make a decision. Stay with it. Sometimes take the tough course.
Yeah.
It's nice to hear his words again, Ann. And, now that we are in this era there's such tension between the press and the White House, you were there for President George H.W. Bush. What was that relationship like?
Two things to remember. He was the pre-internet revolution. We didn't have email. We didn't have any way a president could directly talk to the American people except through the media. And as much as George Bush chafed under some of the coverage, which was not always very often unflattering, he still appreciated the fact that this was part of how government worked. And on the days that Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, and I blurted out a question to him, and he kind of barked at me, and the next day, he sent me a letter of apology saying I wasn't too pleased with my answers to. And years later,
Are you okay?
I need water.
And it bothered him.
with a happy face wearing a frown.
And George W. Bush, who had a harder edge when he was working for his dad in the White House, he was more of an enforcer. When he was president, he had a different affect toward the press, as John and I know, but like the press, had a good relationship, and he too would always stop to write a kind note. When my first son was born, or when I was involved in some flap,
Shorter notes.
Arguing with somebody in the White House. So it was a trait that.
I want to be clear. It's not as if he loved the media coverage. I mean, there was the bumper sticker in '92, "Annoy the press, re-elect Bush." That existed, but it existed nothing like it exists today. Which brings us, Shannon, if you want to weigh in here, to the obvious contrast, and there is an obvious contrast to the politics of George H.W. Bush and the politics of today. And, it speaks volumes that Bush 41, demanded that President Trump, or asked for President Trump to attend his funeral.
Right. I mean, the contrasts are so stark. I think on the domestic front, one of the really amazing pieces of legislation that he passed was the American with Disabilities Act. I have family members who benefited from that. I think the whole country has benefited from that. And on the world stage, great example right now with what's going on with Saudi Arabia. My parents came from China. We were very, very upset and concerned over the Tiananmen Square situation. And the president walked that fine line. He was very hard, understood the security issues, listened to his intelligence briefing, and at the same time, behind the scenes, worked very masterfully, subtly, to make sure that they preserved that state-to-state relationship. Such a contrast to what we have at the moment, which is just entirely the politics of personality going on.
But Anita, I think that just as John was saying, it is notable that he did not go to John McCain's funeral, that President Trump did not go to John McCain's and wasn't welcome. That President Bush felt, I guess it was his nature to have compromise and to reach across the aisle.
This is a picture right now at the funeral of Barbara Bush, and you can see all the living former presidents. I guess Jimmy Carter's not there, but you can see President Clinton, Bush 43, President Obama there, in a picture with George H.W. Bush.
Well, to Allison's question, I would respond, we can go right back to that letter that George H.W. Bush wrote to Bill Clinton, "You're our president now." And that's how George H.W. Bush feels about Donald Trump, or felt about Donald Trump as well, even though he didn't vote for him. We know that. Barbara Bush wrote in her own son's name in the 2016 election. But, politics aside, it's the respect for the institution of the presidency. And that guided him his entire life. And all of us who work for him learned that too. I look at this and how lucky myself, my husband, the thousands of friends that have all been writing about how lucky and privileged we were to learn these lessons of leadership. at his command.
I was at the Kennedy Center Honors last night running
Yeah,
into a
I
number
saw
of
you
people who were good friends of the Bushes. And to a person, what they lamented was the passing of that era, and would that kind of politics ever return? The Bush family, the son and the father, wore the presidency extremely well. Now, that's a separate observation from whether you agreed with them. Certainly W43 presided over a very difficult time in American politics and in America with the country at war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But he always wore the office well, and they both believe that the presidency is bigger than themselves, which is not something that this president always adheres to. But I think that invitation to the funeral is a sign that this is a rare club that they're all part of.
And it's wonderful in this country that we have former presidents who can be at moments like this. You don't see former kings going to the funerals of current kings or dictators. I mean, this is an important moment for the country, and I think it's that Bush 41 knew that and knew that President Trump.
Mrs. Obama's interrupting her foreign book tour to come to the funeral. I think that is a big statement.
We're going to move on to a different subject, but before we do, Ann Compton, I just want you to tell us the president's internet domain name, his email address is what, or was what?
I actually got an email from a president, former president, and his domain is flfw.com. Former leader of the free world. I've never had email in the White House, but was proud of that former leader of the free world.
That's wonderful. I just wanted everyone to know that because that shows you, I think, the humor that he
Can
had.
I just say, I mean, Ann covered him. Also, Maureen Dowd has written a great piece in the New York Times about their very odd and enduring relationship. I mean, somebody who often had a problem with the New York Times, especially her criticism of his son, but they stayed connected.
All right, Shannon, the Mueller investigation does continue. We don't know if maybe he'll take a 2 or 3 day pause to honor the late person. He might. I mean, it wouldn't be out of character for Robert Mueller to do something like that. But last we did know, Michael Cohen was pleading guilty to lying to Congress. And then Friday night, we got a court filing from his attorneys asking for leniency in sentencing. And let me just read part of that out loud. And if we can put it up on the screen, I have to cheat off Allison's notes here. All right.
As usual.
Yeah, as usual. He could have fought the government and continued to hold to the party line, positioning himself perhaps for a pardon or clemency, but instead for himself, his family, his country, he took responsibility for his own wrongdoing and contributed, and is prepared to continue to contribute to an investigation that he views as thoroughly and legitimate and vital. And also within that filing, Shannon, they provided more details, Michael Cohen did, about how he says President Trump was informed of his negotiation with the Russians all the way until June of 2016.
Right. I mean, the entire Cohen situation has always been very, very dangerous and threatening for the president because it's his lawyer. It's someone who listens to unguarded thoughts and musings. What we're seeing in that filing is they're really doing two things. They're emphasizing the overall importance of Cohen's role and how much pressure he took from the president of the United States, publicly bashing him constantly and saying he deserves some credit for really standing up and doing the right thing there. They also make some technical arguments with regard to the sentencing guidelines, asking for some minor reductions the way it's been calculated. But I think overall, the big takeaway I've had from this new revelation with Cohen is just how much danger it poses to not only the president, but potentially even his legal team, because they have gone so public with this joint defense agreement with Manafort. Manafort now, the prosecutors, Mueller's team is saying, was lying to them, withholding things. If the president's intel was from Manafort, there's a problem there. Rudy Giuliani is on TV saying, we had that joint defense agreement. We know Manafort's being pressured, but obviously Cohen, very much the opposite information coming out from that, and that could be very serious jeopardy for the president and could even convert his lawyers into witnesses potentially.
Can I raise one point that I think has been interesting as I've talked to lawyers? If you looked at the plea agreement with Cohen, they go beyond really what was necessary just to explain the plea agreement to talk about those contacts with the Kremlin. And lawyers I've talked to have raised the question, well, why would they need to do that? That wasn't necessary for the plea. It may have something to do with the president's own answers in those written questions, perhaps denying any of those Kremlin contacts. So I think one specific area here is the financial relationship between the Trump enterprise and Russian officials, Russian oligarchs. This is an area that has always hovered over this investigation as something really intriguing.
All right, guys, stick around if you will. We have a lot more to discuss, including David Gregory's fantastic night at the Kennedy Center Honors last night. Your contribution,
Do you want to know what I was wearing?
Your contribution to the arts over the decades has been unparalleled.
I was being honored, actually.
Appreciate that.